September 23rd, 1943, 0300 hours, 400 feet beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. Commander Lawson Ramage stood in the cramped control room of USS Trout, his eyes fixed on the depth gauge as the hull groaned under crushing pressure. Above them, somewhere in the darkness, Japanese destroyers crisscrossed the water, their depth charges exploding in patterns that sent shockwaves through the submarine's steel frame. But Ramage wasn't thinking about the destroyers. He was thinking about the convoy he'd just attacked. 6 cargo ships, all heavily loaded, steaming toward Manila with reinforcements desperately needed for the Philippines garrison. In the span of 15 minutes, Trout had fired 8 torpedoes. 7 had struck their targets. 7 had exploded exactly as designed. 2 ships were already gone, swallowed by the depths. 3 more were burning, listing heavily, their cargo holds flooding. The 6th was dead in the water, its engine room destroyed by a torpedo that had torn through the hull and detonated with perfect precision. It was the kind of attack that would have been impossible just 6 months earlier, not because American submarines lacked the skill or the courage, but because their torpedoes simply did not work. What the Japanese Navy did not yet fully comprehend. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What their intelligence officers were only beginning to understand as convoy after convoy disappeared into the depths was that something fundamental had changed in the Pacific Submarine War. The weapon they had learned to dismiss as ineffective, the American submarine force that had struggled through 18 months of humiliating failures, had suddenly transformed into the most lethal maritime predator in history. The transformation happened in the span of a single year. From January to December 1943, American submarines evolved from frustrated hunters firing defective weapons into a coordinated killing force that would sink more than 1.5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. By 1944, that number would double to 3 million tons. By the war's end, American submarines would destroy 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet. But the true horror for Japan was not measured in tonnage statistics. It was measured in the psychological terror that consumed every Japanese sailor ordered to board a transport ship, the grinding fear that accompanied every voyage through waters where invisible hunters waited. The knowledge that your ship could be torn apart by torpedoes fired from a submarine you never saw, would never see, until the moment of impact. This is the story of how 1943 became the year Japanese sailors learned to fear American submarines more than anything else in the Pacific War, more than carrier aircraft, more than surface fleets, more than the grinding attrition of island warfare. It is the story of how working torpedoes, superior technology, broken codes, and aggressive commanders combined to create a campaign of maritime destruction so complete that Japan's war economy collapsed not from bombing raids, but from strangulation. The slow, methodical choking of supply lines by submarines operating thousands of miles from American bases. The nightmare began not in 1943, but in December 1941, with a weapon that did not work. The Mark 14 torpedo, pride of the United States Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, was fundamentally broken. It suffered from not 1, but 3 catastrophic defects that rendered it nearly useless in combat. First, the depth control mechanism was miscalibrated. Torpedoes were set to run at a specific depth, typically 10 feet, aimed at a ship's waterline where the explosion would cause maximum damage. But the Mark 14 ran 10 to 15 feet deeper than set. Submarine commanders watched through periscopes as their perfectly aimed torpedoes passed harmlessly beneath enemy hulls, running too deep to strike anything vital. The problem stemmed from a bureaucratic failure that bordered on criminal negligence. When the Bureau of Ordnance increased the size of the warhead, making the torpedo heavier, they failed to recalibrate the depth control mechanism. The heavier torpedo naturally ran deeper, but because the Navy refused to conduct live-fire tests with actual warheads, considering them too expensive at $10,000 each, the defect was never discovered. Second, the magnetic influence exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel and break its back, either exploded prematurely or not at all. The magnetic exploder was supposed to sense the change in Earth's magnetic field caused by a steel hull passing overhead. In theory, brilliant. In practice, catastrophic. Variations in Earth's magnetic field at different latitudes caused the exploder to trigger early, sending torpedoes detonating hundreds of yards before reaching target. Or the exploder would fail to trigger at all, and the torpedo would pass harmlessly beneath the enemy ship. Submarine commanders reported hearing their torpedoes strike enemy hulls with metallic clangs, only to watch the weapons bounce off without exploding. Third, even when the magnetic exploder was deactivated and the torpedo ran at the correct depth, the contact exploder often failed. The firing pin was too heavy. When the torpedo struck at optimal angles, typically 90 degrees to the target's hull, the impact crushed the firing pin before it could trigger the detonator. The torpedo would crumple against the hull and either bounce off or break apart. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder of USS Seawolf documented the horror in his patrol reports. Over 6 patrols in early 1942, Seawolf fired spread after spread of torpedoes at Japanese convoys. The crew heard explosions. The sonar operators tracked torpedoes striking hulls. But time after time, Japanese ships sailed away unharmed. In one attack, Warder fired 4 Mark 14 torpedoes at a stationary Japanese transport from 1,500 yards. 4 metallic clangs echoed through the submarine as the torpedoes struck. 0 explosions. The transport, apparently undamaged, weighed anchor and departed. Frustrated beyond measure, Warder switched to the older Mark 10 torpedoes, World War I-era weapons that Seawolf still carried as backup. The difference was immediate. The Mark 10s, though slower and shorter ranged, actually exploded when they hit targets. Seawolf's success rate improved dramatically, but most submarines carried only Mark 14s. For 18 months, from December 1941 through mid-1943, American submarine commanders sailed into combat with weapons that betrayed them. They executed perfect attacks, firing at ideal ranges and angles, only to watch their targets escape unharmed. The psychological toll was devastating. Submarine crews trained for years to master the complex calculations of torpedo firing. Speed, angle, range, target heading, all had to be computed with split-second precision while submerged, watching through a periscope that could only be raised for seconds at a time. The margin for error was razor-thin. To do everything correctly and then watch the torpedo fail was agony. It was worse than missing. A miss could be corrected, learned from, improved. But when the torpedo struck the target and simply refused to explode, there was nothing the crew could do. The problem was not their skill. It was the weapon. For the Japanese merchant marine in 1942, this catastrophic failure was a gift. They sailed with confidence, assured by their military that American submarines posed minimal threat. Japanese convoy doctrine, developed in the 1920s, assumed submarines would attack warships in fleet actions, not merchant vessels in commerce warfare. Japan had allocated exactly 47 vessels for convoy escort duty when the war began. By comparison, Britain employed over 400 escorts in the Atlantic. The Imperial Japanese Navy viewed convoy protection as defensive, unglamorous work beneath samurai warriors. The elite destroyer force was reserved for offensive operations against American carriers and battleships. Captain Tamichihara of destroyer Shigure later wrote in his memoir, "We treated submarine defense as an afterthought, a duty for obsolete ships and inexperienced crews. Protecting merchant ships was considered unglamorous work. The Americans could not hurt us." He was tragically, temporarily correct. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 725,000 tons. A respectable number, but far below the campaign's potential. Many ships survived submarine attacks because the torpedoes simply refused to explode, Japanese merchant officers who survived these attacks reported the incidents to naval intelligence. Torpedoes striking hulls without detonating, submarines breaking off attacks after single hits. The pattern suggested American submarine weapons were defective. Some Japanese vessels reportedly pulled into port with unexploded American torpedoes embedded in their hulls. This intelligence led Japanese Naval Command to a catastrophic conclusion. American submarines were not a serious threat. Their tactics were timid, their weapons were unreliable. Convoy protection could remain a low priority. That conclusion would cost Japan the war. The breaking point came in July 1943. USS Tinosa, under Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit, encountered the Tonan Maru No. 3, a 19,000-ton Japanese oil tanker sailing alone in the Philippine Sea. The tanker was stopped, dead in the water, making emergency repairs. It was every submarine commander's dream, an undefended, stationary target. Daspit maneuvered Tinosa into perfect firing position and launched 4 torpedoes from 1,500 yards. All 4 struck. The sonar operator heard the distinctive thump of torpedoes hitting hull plates. Only 1 exploded. The tanker, damaged but still afloat, began maneuvering. Daspit pursued throughout the day, firing spread after spread. 15 torpedoes total, 12 scored direct hits, only 1 exploded. The Tonan Maru No. 3 escaped. When Tinosa returned to Pearl Harbor, Daspit was, in the words of Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific, still almost speechless with rage. He had done everything correctly. His crew had executed textbook attacks. The torpedoes had hit their targets, and the Bureau of Ordnance's weapons had betrayed them. Lockwood, himself a former submarine commander, had been fighting the Bureau of Ordnance for 2 years. The Bureau insisted the torpedoes were perfect. Any failures were the fault of submarine commanders and poor maintenance. When Lockwood's officers reported problems, the Bureau blamed them for incompetence. But Daspit's patrol report was undeniable. 15 torpedoes fired at a stationary target, 12 hits, 1 explosion. Even the Bureau of Ordnance could not explain that away. Lockwood ordered comprehensive testing. In August 1942, submarines had proven the depth control problem by firing torpedoes at fishing nets suspended at measured depths. The torpedoes passed beneath the nets, running deeper than set. The Bureau of Ordnance was forced to acknowledge the defect and implement corrections. By June 1943, the magnetic influence exploder was finally deactivated on all torpedoes in the Pacific Fleet after relentless pressure from submarine commanders. ComSubPac issued the order on June 24, 1943. Contact exploders only, no magnetic detonation. But the contact exploder still failed. Through July and August 1943, Lockwood supervised tests at Pearl Harbor that finally isolated the problem. The firing pin was too heavy. It crushed on impact instead of triggering the detonator. The solution came from an unexpected source. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, American forces had shot down several Japanese aircraft. When engineers examined the wrecked planes, they discovered the propeller blades were made from a lightweight aluminum alloy far superior to anything in American arsenals. The Navy reverse-engineered the alloy and used it to manufacture lighter firing pins for the Mark 14 torpedo. Combined with stiffer springs in the contact mechanism, the modified exploder finally worked reliably. By September 1943, the first torpedoes with corrected contact exploders were sent to war. On September 30, 1943, USS Barb departed Pearl Harbor on war patrol. She was the first American submarine to sail with a full load of completely reliable torpedoes. The Pacific War was nearly 2 years old. 20 American submarines had already been lost in combat. Thousands of torpedoes had been wasted. Hundreds of attacks had failed. Entire Japanese convoys had escaped destruction because the weapons simply did not work. But now, finally, American submarines possessed torpedoes that ran at the correct depth, detonated reliably on contact, and could be fired with confidence. The transformation was immediate and devastating. In 1943, American submarines sank 335 Japanese merchant ships, totaling approximately 1.5 million tons. This was nearly double the total for all of 1942. The year was not even over when the numbers made clear that something fundamental had changed. The mathematics were brutal for Japan. In January 1943, bulk commodities reaching Japan totaled 19.4 million tons. By December, that number had fallen to 16.4 million tons despite Japanese merchant marine capacity remaining relatively stable. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. More critically, ships were being sunk faster than Japanese shipyards could build new ones. Japan's annual shipbuilding capacity was approximately 1 million tons. American submarines in late 1943 were sinking ships at a rate exceeding 2 million tons annually. The gap was unsurvivable. Every month, Japan's merchant fleet shrank. Every convoy that sailed faced submarines equipped with working torpedoes, superior radar, and intelligence that often provided exact convoy routes days in advance. Operation Magic and ultra code breaking gave American submarines an overwhelming advantage. Allied cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes in 1942. By mid-1943, they had also cracked the Japanese merchant shipping code. This meant American submarine commanders received intelligence detailing convoy routes, departure times, composition, and even cargo manifests. Submarines could position themselves days in advance along convoy routes and wait in ambush. The Japanese sailed according to schedules that American submarines had already read. It was not warfare. It was systematic slaughter arranged by appointment. Commander Richard O'Kane, who would later command USS Tang to become the highest-scoring submarine captain in American naval history, described the transformation in his memoir. Before September 43, we were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. The torpedoes betrayed us more often than they worked. After September, everything changed. The torpedoes ran true. They hit. They exploded. Suddenly, we were the hunters we had trained to be. For Japanese merchant sailors, the change was immediate and terrifying. Convoys that had survived multiple submarine attacks in early 1943 suddenly found themselves being destroyed. Ships that would have escaped with minor damage in 1942 were now torn apart by perfectly functioning torpedoes. Warrant Officer Kazuo Sakamoto, a convoy escort commander aboard destroyer Hamikaze, filed a classified report in October 1943 that was later captured by American forces. American submarines have become dramatically more effective since August. Ships that previously sustained single torpedo hits now sink rapidly after multiple strikes. The Americans appear to have corrected whatever defects plagued their weapons earlier in the war. The report continued with growing alarm. Submarines now attack with surface radar at night, using technology we cannot counter. They coordinate in groups, overwhelming our escorts. They receive intelligence about our routes, allowing them to position in advance. We cannot protect the convoys. Every voyage becomes a death sentence for crews who know the Americans are waiting. The psychological impact rippled through the Japanese merchant marine. Officers who had sailed fearlessly in 1942 now requested transfers to shore duty. Crews demanded double pay for voyages through submarine-infested waters, particularly the Luzon Strait between Taiwan and Luzon, which Japanese sailors called Torpedo Alley. Captain Yoshio Nakamura, executive officer of cargo ship Tatsuta Maru, wrote his final diary entry on February 8, 1943, after his ship detected an American submarine on radar. Submarine contact. American. This is the end. USS Tarpon fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 hit. Tatsuta Maru, a former luxury liner that had carried tourists between San Francisco and Tokyo before the war, sank in 90 seconds. 943 passengers and crew had no time to reach lifeboats. The ship simply vanished. Nakamura's watch, recovered when his diary washed ashore years later, stopped at 3:47 in the morning. The sinking of Tatsutamaru marked a psychological turning point. The ship was well known, prestigious. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A symbol of Japanese merchant maritime excellence. Its destruction in seconds demonstrated that no ship was safe. Not fast ships, not large ships, not famous ships. By early 1944, the campaign had intensified beyond Japanese capacity to respond. The number of operational American submarines had grown from 55 in December 1941 to over 100 by January 1944. New construction delivered approximately 40 submarines per year from American shipyards. Each submarine made approximately 5 patrols annually. Each patrol lasted roughly 60 days. With 100 submarines rotating through combat zones, Japanese merchant ships faced continuous coverage of every major shipping lane from the Japanese home islands to Singapore, from the Philippines to New Guinea. Convoys that sailed on predictable schedules to known destinations became coffins for thousands of men. The Americans knew the routes, they knew the timing, they knew the cargo. They waited in ambush and struck with devastating efficiency. The summer of 1944 brought particular horror to Japanese convoys. By this point, American submarines had perfected wolfpack tactics, coordinating multiple submarines against single convoys. While German U-boats had pioneered wolfpack operations in the Atlantic, American submarines refined the tactic for the vast distances of the Pacific. A typical wolfpack consisted of 3 submarines operating under coordinated command. When one submarine detected a convoy, it would shadow the target and radio position reports to the other pack members. The submarines would position themselves along the convoy's projected path and attack simultaneously or in sequence, overwhelming the escorts. Japanese escort vessels, already inadequate in number and capability, simply could not defend against coordinated attacks. When one submarine struck, escorts would race toward the attack, dropping depth charges and searching for the attacker. This left the convoy exposed to follow-up attacks by other wolfpack members. The tactic proved devastatingly effective. In June 1944, convoy Teikichi carrying reinforcements for the Philippines lost 4 transports to wolfpack attacks. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers drowned when American submarines sank their ships before the convoy could reach its destination. The loss was catastrophic, not just in terms of personnel, but in psychological impact. These were veteran troops from China, experienced soldiers Japan could not replace. They drowned in darkness, trapped in sinking holds as American torpedoes tore through steel hulls. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping strategy succeeded partly because Japanese garrisons were systematically isolated and undersupplied. American submarines created that isolation. Every Japanese defensive position that withered without reinforcements, every garrison that surrendered due to starvation and lack of ammunition, was a garrison that submarines had cut off from support. Japanese military leadership could no longer deny the catastrophic effectiveness of American submarines. In December 1944, Army General Yoshijiro Umezu submitted a report to the Imperial War Council that concluded, "Submarine attacks have rendered seaborne reinforcement of our defensive positions impossible. The Philippines cannot be adequately reinforced. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies cannot supply fuel to the homeland because tankers are sunk faster than they can be replaced." The report continued with brutal honesty. Strategic raw materials from Southeast Asia accumulate in warehouses because transport ships no longer arrive. The American submarine campaign has strangled our war economy. Without imported oil, our aircraft cannot fly, our warships cannot sail, our industries cannot produce. We are being defeated not by superior force, but by superior strategy. The statistics supported this assessment. Japan began the war with 6.4 million tons of merchant shipping. By the end of 1944, only 2.1 million tons remained operational. New construction during the war added 3.9 million tons, but losses exceeded these gains catastrophically. American submarines accounted for approximately 55% of these losses, sinking over 5 million tons of merchant shipping during the war. The remaining losses came from carrier aircraft, land-based bombers, and mines. But submarines were the primary destroyer of Japan's maritime capability. By March 1945, Japan's shipping capacity had fallen below the 2 million tons required to feed the Japanese civilian population. Starvation became a real possibility. Imports of food from Korea and Manchuria, desperately needed to sustain the home islands, could not be delivered safely. The human cost was equally staggering. Conservative estimates suggest American submarines killed at least 97,342 Japanese soldiers in transport sinkings during the Pacific War. This exceeds American combat deaths inflicted by the Marine Corps and Army combined during the entire Central Pacific drive from Tarawa in November 1943 to Iwo Jima in February through March 1945. Additional tens of thousands of merchant sailors, civilian workers, and forced laborers died in the same attacks. Korean and Chinese laborers, conscripted by Japan and transported in unmarked ships, drowned by the thousands when submarines sank vessels without warning. Allied prisoners of war suffered the same fate. Japan transported POWs in unmarked vessels called hell ships by survivors. When American submarines torpedoed these vessels, thousands of Allied prisoners died. The Americans had no way to know prisoners were aboard. Japanese vessels were not marked according to Geneva Convention protocols. Estimates suggest approximately 10,800 Allied prisoners of war died in submarine attacks during the Pacific War. The submarines operated under unrestricted warfare rules. Every Japanese merchant ship was considered a legitimate military target. No warnings were given. For Japanese sailors who survived submarine attacks, the psychological trauma never healed. Ensign Haruki Ito, who survived the sinking of transport Mayasan Maru in November 1944 by clinging to debris for 18 hours, described the experience in a 1978 interview. The torpedo hit sounded like a massive hammer striking an iron plate. The ship lurched violently. Men fell down ladders. Water rushed into the hold. Emergency lighting failed immediately. In complete darkness, thousands of men tried to reach the deck. Most could not find the ladders. Those who did found them blocked with panicking soldiers. His voice broke as he continued. The ship rolled and began sinking. I was on deck when the torpedo struck, which saved my life. I jumped into the water and swam away. She sank in approximately 2 minutes. The suction pulled men underwater. I heard them screaming, then silence. Every time I close my eyes, I see the ship sinking and hear the screaming. It never stops. The terror was not limited to the moment of attack. Japanese sailors lived in constant fear during every voyage. They watched the water for periscopes that appeared for seconds before torpedoes struck. They listened for the churning wake of incoming torpedoes, knowing that sound meant they had perhaps 20 seconds to decide whether to jump overboard or run for lifeboats. Usually, there was no time for either choice. American submarines used patterns of torpedoes, ensuring multiple hits that guaranteed rapid sinking. Most ships went down in minutes. Men below decks drowned. Men on deck faced the horror of watching their ship disappear beneath them, often taking shipmates who were trapped inside. Captain Kazushige Matsumura, a merchant marine officer who survived the sinking of Nitaren Maru in September 1944, provided testimony during post-war interviews that captures the psychological burden. We knew the Americans were waiting for us. The question was not if we would be attacked, but when. Sailing through submarine waters at night, every man aboard was awake, staring into darkness, listening. He paused, then continued. When you heard the sound of torpedoes in the water, you had seconds to live. The torpedo struck. The ship shuddered. Water rushed in. If you were below decks, you drowned. If you were on deck, you might survive, but only if the ship sank slowly enough for lifeboats to launch. We called them the silent death because you never saw them coming. Just the sound of torpedoes, then explosion, then screaming and darkness. By late 1944, Japanese convoy routes were being abandoned as too dangerous. The Luzon Strait, critical for shipping between Japan and Southeast Asia, became a killing zone where submarines sank convoy after convoy. Japanese naval intelligence identified the strait as a death trap, but lacked resources to adequately protect convoys transiting those waters. Convoy HI 81 inches, November 1944, demonstrated the catastrophic consequences. The convoy included escort carriers Shinyo and Akitsu Maru, destroyer Kasumi, multiple escort vessels, and 3 large landing craft depot ships carrying over 4,000 Japanese soldiers. On November 17th, USS Queenfish fired 4 torpedoes at Akitsu Maru. 3 struck. The escort carrier sank in 3 minutes. 2,150 people died, mostly soldiers trapped below decks. Hours later, USS Pikuda torpedoed Mayasan Maru. The landing ship exploded and sank with 3,437 men killed. The following night, USS Spadefish attacked the convoy again, torpedoing escort carrier Shinyo. 4 torpedoes hit. The carrier caught fire and sank with 1,130 Japanese sailors. Submarine chaser number 156 was destroyed with all hands. Over 4 days, convoy HI 81 lost 4 major vessels and nearly 7,000 Japanese killed. The convoy turned back to Shanghai, reformed with replacement escorts, then split into 2 groups. One group eventually reached Manila, the other reached Singapore. But the division that was supposed to reinforce the Philippines arrived without most of its heavy equipment, artillery, and supplies. The division would fight as light infantry, lacking the weapons needed for effective combat against American forces. The failure of convoy HI 81 forced Japanese Imperial Headquarters to acknowledge that seaborne reinforcement of the Philippines was no longer feasible. The strategic implications extended beyond simple loss of ships and personnel. American submarines forced Japan to adopt convoy systems that drastically reduced shipping efficiency. Ships waiting to form convoys sat idle for days or weeks. Zigzag. Routes designed to avoid submarines added days to every voyage. Slower convoy speeds reduced the number of trips each ship could make annually. Combined with actual sinkings, these inefficiencies reduced Japan's effective shipping capacity by approximately 60%, even for ships that survived. A merchant fleet that should have been capable of transporting 10 million tons annually could barely manage 4 million tons due to convoy delays, route diversions, and the constant need for ships to travel in protected groups. Moreover, the submarine campaign diverted Japanese resources from offensive operations to defensive convoy protection. Destroyers that could have escorted carrier task forces instead protected merchant convoys. Aircraft that could have struck American bases instead flew anti-submarine patrols. Radar systems that could have warned of bomber raids instead searched for submarines. The psychological burden of defending against an invisible enemy that struck without warning consumed Japanese military planning throughout the last 2 years of the war. Every decision had to account for submarine threat. Every operation had to consider whether supplies could actually reach the destination or would be sunk en route. Japanese defensive strategy became impossible to execute. Operation Show, Japan's plan to defend the Philippines, required massive reinforcement of garrison forces. American submarines prevented these reinforcements from arriving. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was fought with Japanese forces in the Philippines significantly weaker than planned, because submarines had sunk the transport convoys carrying reinforcements. The same pattern repeated throughout the Pacific. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands withered without supplies. Defensive positions on critical islands lacked adequate ammunition and equipment. Reinforcements designated for threatened areas never arrived because submarines interdicted the convoys. By early 1945, American submarines faced an unexpected problem. They could not find enough targets. The Japanese merchant fleet had been so thoroughly decimated that submarines returned from patrols having never fired their torpedoes. The war against shipping was effectively over. Japan had no merchant fleet left to sink. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb began attacking trains and factories along the Japanese coast with his deck gun because there were no ships left to sink. Commander Lawson Ramage requested reassignment because submarine warfare had become obsolete due to lack of targets. The strategic impact exceeded every pre-war projection. Japan's war economy collapsed not because factories were destroyed, but because raw materials could not reach the factories. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies were sunk before reaching Japan. Rubber, tin, and other strategic materials accumulated in Southeast Asian ports, but could not be transported. By March 1945, Japan's oil stockpiles were essentially depleted. The combined fleet could not sortie for lack of fuel. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Training flights were cancelled because fuel could not be spared. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, reduced to a handful of operational warships, remained in port as floating batteries, unable to leave harbour. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that the campaign against shipping was perhaps the most decisive single factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy and the logistic support of Japanese military and naval power. American submarines, representing less than 2% of the United States Navy's tonnage, strangled an empire. The effectiveness derived from multiple factors that compounded into overwhelming superiority. First, technological advantage. American submarines carried surface search radar, aircraft warning radar, and sonar superior to Japanese equipment. American torpedoes, once corrected, were reliable and deadly. Second, intelligence superiority. Operation Magic and Ultra provided advanced warning of convoy routes, schedules, and composition. American submarines knew where targets would be days before they arrived. Third, tactical innovation. Wolfpack tactics coordinated multiple submarines against single convoys, overwhelming escorts and ensuring convoy destruction even if individual submarines were driven off. Fourth, operational doctrine. Unrestricted submarine warfare authorized by Admiral Chester Nimitz within hours of Pearl Harbor meant no warnings were given to merchant ships. Every Japanese vessel was considered a military target. Fifth, industrial capacity. American shipyards produced 228 submarines during World War II, replacing losses and expanding the force continuously. Japanese shipyards built fewer than 176 submarines during the same period, and most were used against warships rather than merchant vessels. Finally, crew quality. American submariners were volunteers, extensively trained and highly motivated. Rest and recuperation policies between patrols prevented combat exhaustion. Competition for submarine assignments was intense. By contrast, Japanese merchant marine crews by 1944 included impressed sailors, poorly trained recruits, and officers who requested transfer to any position other than convoy duty. The cumulative effect created a system of destruction Japan could not counter. Captain Atsushi Oi of the Imperial Japanese Navy wrote a post-war analysis titled "Why Japan's Anti-Submarine Warfare Failed" that identified every major deficiency. But understanding the problem and solving it were different matters. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to build hundreds of escorts. Japan lacked the technological base to develop radar and sonar equivalent to American systems. Japan lacked the cultural flexibility to shift from offensive fleet warfare doctrine to defensive convoy protection. Most critically, Japan lacked time. For the Japanese merchant mariners who survived the war, the memory of American submarines remained vivid decades later. In a 1987 reunion of Japanese merchant marine veterans in Tokyo, survivor testimonies revealed psychological scars that never healed. Former Captain Teiji Yamada, who survived 3 separate submarine attacks, described his nightmares. "I am 82 years old. The war ended 42 years ago. But every night, I dream of the submarines. I am on the bridge of my ship, watching the water. I see the periscope break the surface. I hear the sound of torpedoes launching. I try to turn the ship, but I move in slow motion. The torpedoes hit, the ship shudders, men scream. Then I wake up. For 42 years, the same dream. Another survivor, former engineer officer Kenji Matsumoto, recalled the moment his ship was struck. We were 60 miles south of Formosa when the torpedoes struck. I was in the engine room. The impact threw me against the bulkhead. Water rushed in. Lights failed. In darkness, I felt my way to the ladder. Men were climbing over each other, crushing the weak. I made it to the deck. The ship was listing heavily. I jumped into the water. Oil covered the surface. I swam away from the ship. Behind me, men still trapped aboard were screaming as the ship went down. I floated for 6 hours before rescue. Of 600 men aboard, 184 survived. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities succeeded partly because Japanese fighters lacked fuel to intercept American bombers. Submarines had sunk the tankers that would have brought oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japanese refineries. The American advance through the Pacific succeeded partly because Japanese garrisons were isolated, undersupplied, and unable to receive reinforcements. Submarines had cut the supply lines. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of war's end, a memorial was dedicated in Tokyo to Japanese merchant mariners who died during World War II. The memorial wall lists 60,000 names of merchant sailors killed in the war. Most died in submarine attacks. The inscription reads, "They sailed into danger, knowing death awaited them. They served their nation faithfully until the sea claimed them. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten." Among the names on that wall are the thousands who died in the great convoy disasters. The 4,755 men of Tamatsu Maru, sunk in minutes by USS Spadefish. The 2,665 people aboard Teiya Maru, torpedoed by USS Rasha. The 3,437 soldiers of Mayasan Maru, destroyed by USS Pikuda. These names represent only a fraction of the dead. For every named casualty, 3 more died whose names were never recorded, lost in ships that sank so completely that casualty lists could never be compiled. The final accounting of American submarine warfare against Japan reveals numbers that stagger comprehension. 1,314 Japanese merchant ships sunk, over 5.3 million tons of merchant shipping destroyed, 97,342 Japanese soldiers killed in transport sinkings, tens of thousands of merchant sailors killed, thousands of forced laborers and prisoners of war killed, Japan's war economy strangled, strategic resources unable to reach the homeland, oil supplies exhausted, food imports ceased, industrial production collapsed, all accomplished by a force that never exceeded 288 submarines and 16,000 personnel serving at sea. The transformation happened in 1943. Before that year, American submarines struggled with defective torpedoes and limited effectiveness. After that year, they became the most lethal anti-shipping force in naval history. The key was simple. Working torpedoes, reliable weapons that ran at correct depth, struck their targets, and exploded as designed. Combined with superior technology, broken codes, aggressive tactics, and industrial capacity, those working torpedoes transformed American submarines from frustrated hunters into systematic destroyers of Japan's maritime capability. The Japanese learned to fear submarines more than anything else because submarines represented a threat they could not counter, could not see, could not predict, and could not escape. For Japanese sailors ordered to board transports, the voyage became a death sentence. They sailed into waters patrolled by invisible hunters. They watched for periscopes that appeared for seconds before torpedoes struck. They heard trapped men screaming as compartments flooded. They floated in oil-covered water, hoping for rescue that often never came. and they continued to sail because duty demanded it, even as fear consumed them. Most did not survive. The silent death, as Japanese sailors called American submarines, claimed more Japanese lives than any weapon system in the Pacific War except aerial bombing. It destroyed Japan's capacity to sustain its empire, isolated Japanese garrisons across the Pacific, and strangled Japan's war economy. Survivors woke screaming from nightmares of torpedoes, striking their ships for decades after the war ended. American submarines did not just sink ships. They sank Japan's ability to wage war and shattered the confidence of every Japanese sailor who watched his ship disappear beneath the waves. The fear was not of dying in battle, but of dying helplessly, trapped in a sinking hold, drowning in darkness, while an invisible enemy escaped untouched. That fear explains why Japanese sailors called American submarines the weapon they feared more than anything else in the Pacific. After 1943, when the torpedoes finally worked, that fear became justified. The mathematics were inescapable. More submarines, better weapons, superior intelligence, aggressive commanders. The combination was unstoppable. Japan's merchant fleet was annihilated more thoroughly than any merchant fleet in history, and it happened because in 1943 American submarines finally received the one thing they had lacked since the war began: torpedoes that worked. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.